Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with James Lee Burke to discuss Another Kind of Eden, published by our friends at Simon & Schuster. James Lee Burke is a New York Times best-selling author, two-time winner of the Edgar Award, and the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship for Creative Arts in Fiction. He's authored 39 novels and 2 short story collections. He lives in Missoula, Montana. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Michael Connelly. Michael is the author of 35 previous novels, including the New York Times bestsellers The Law of Innocence, Fair Warning, and The Night Fire. His books, which include the Harry Bosch series, the Lincoln Lawyer series, and the Renee Ballard series, have sold more than 80 million copies worldwide. Wow. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Another Kind of Eden from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Well, hello.
Hello, how are y'all doing? Hi, Michael. Hi, Christina.
Jim, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us here tonight. I do a few of these over the course of the year, and I get nervous whenever I do one with you because you're my hero, man. I think you're the best thing going for a number of decades, and I really mean that. So,
well, thank you.
And now this book, I got to hold it up here. Fantastic, another great book. It's weird when I hold it up on my camera, it's backwards. You guys see it, right?
Yeah, I have an altar here for mine.
Well, let's. I know we're going to ask some questions from the audience, but let me ask some of my questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
The New York Times has called you the reigning champ of nostalgia noir. Do you? What do you think about that? Do you accept that as a compliment or a complaint?
Well, I thought it was pretty complimentary. Yeah, that's pretty good.
I mean, I think this new book is going to add to that. I agree. It's a very complimentary thing.
Yeah.
You have a book here set in the early 60s.
Yeah.
But before we talk specifically about it, to me, there's no sense in doing this work at this level and pace, the level and pace I'm talking about with you, if you're not going for something beyond mystery and entertainment, a higher purpose, if you will, maybe mystery with a message. And with a book like this, it feels to me, are you trying to use the past to inform the present? What would you say is your higher purpose with this particular book?
That's very well said. I think your answer is in your question, and the question is the answer. That's very well said, and it goes back to your mention about noir. Is that a compliment or is that a derogatory statement? It's a compliment because it immediately suggests the films of the 1940s, the late 1940s and the early 1950s. And those films were studies in black and white, in ink wash. We think of course, the great B films were actually just superb works of filmic art. But yes, I think all artists, and you as well, Michael, take material from the past to illuminate the present. And it's like Diogenes, the Greek philosopher, with his lantern looking for the answer to all the great mysteries. And that's what art allows us to do. It allows us to transcend time. So I think what you suggested is absolutely on target.
So in this book, We're with Aaron Holland, who we've seen before in The Jealous Kind in particular. And in that one, you kind of staked out the 1950s Texas. Now we're into the next decade with this book. I should mention that Aaron Holland is the would-be writer. He rides the rails. He's seeing the America through the railways and so forth, kind of drifting, gathering experiences. But we're into the next decade. And while all your books are connected by themes and by blood, it kind of feels to me that Aaron may be your chosen tour guide through the decades and through exploring the American identity. And I'm just wondering if is that too lofty to say, or is that on target? And what are you trying to do with Aaron Holland?
Well, again, I think you described it. We first meet him in the novel set in 1952 on the Texas Gulf Coast. Aaron Holland Broussard, and he's a member of the Holland family. And the Holland family are actually my mother's family. They were a frontier people, and I've used them in a number of books, 12, I think. But anyway, that book, I think, is one of my best 3 novels. And here's the reason why. He's a very good narrator, and he is both a man who is troubled by the world, but he has a great love affair with it too. I remember something Robert Frost once said about his art. He said his art is a lover's quarrel with the world, a lover's quarrel with the world. And that book I wrote about life in the early 1950s, and this is a vanity, I guess, I think is one of only about 3 books, novels, that have been an accurate portrayal. The other 2 are, my heavens, The Dukes of Amboy. The man who wrote that also wrote the first screen draft of James Dean's first book, Teenage Hoods, 1954. Golly, I'm
having a problem too.
All right.
Rebel Without a Cause?
Rebel Without a Cause, you got it. Anyway, the portrayal of the 1950s in most television dramas just not accurate. It has nothing to do. Look, Happy Days, forget it. This was a violent time, but it was a great time to be around as well. Anyway, the question is, how does our narrator work as sort of a guide through modern American history? And that's what it's about. The first book, narrated by Aaron, is about the beginnings of, America's right turn into neocolonialism. That's the backdrop of the story. And 10 years later, 1962, Trinidad, Colorado, we discover that he has found what appears to be an Edenic part of the country. He has a job and finally is made a foreman on this enormous ranch and dairy farm and produce farm. And the original title of that book was The Pillars of Heaven, because Aaron thought he had found heaven. And the couple who owned the farm seemed like angelic people, but he is not listening really to some of the things that he hears. They are also a couple from Salem, Massachusetts. And Aaron lost his father when he was a young man and has always yearned to find him. And he finds that father figure in the owner of this farm. And it's from there that we see his journey into ultimately what could only be called evil. And it's the beginning of the drug culture. Also the orphaning of many children, the breakup of the American family, and also the struggle between the migrant workers and the people who own corporate farms. It also deals historically with the Ludlow massacre in 1914. It's a very engaging book, I think. There are many themes in it, but it has a wonderful love affair. And one of my favorite characters is this young woman who waits tables in a Mexican restaurant, and she is a 19-year-old artist, and she's obsessed with the suffering of the people who died at the Ludlow massacre. And it's not a long book, but there's a great deal in it. I'm extremely proud of it. And the best 3 books that I've written, the 39 novels that I've written, are actually the Holland books. That's not to show disrespect for the Robichaux books, but the 3 that I believe that is the best I will ever write are The Jealous Kind, the Sun also, the House of the Rising Sun, and Wayfaring Stranger. And Aaron comes from the same family, who people that trilogy that I wrote about 6 to 8 years ago.
Yeah. And Aaron is a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And so is of your many characters, obviously your characters come from you, but is he more you than perhaps the other characters?
Well,
Has
it's
he
probably
his observation of the world. And as you say, he's worried about the world.
It's probably a matter of definition. I quickly grabbed the virtues. I take full responsibility for the virtues and the characters, and none of the character defects. No, yes, I think that he is the storyteller. He's something like the narrator of the medieval mortality play or morality play. And I've said this before about the Robichaux series. The same is true, that maybe it's just because of my background. My father was something of a historian, and I was always fascinated by not only his knowledge of history, but his belief that it was fundamental that we possess that knowledge or we'll never understand ourselves. And I remember something he said once when I was about 15, 16 years old. And I'd been trying to write short stories since I was in the 5th grade. And he said, "Oh, Jim, just slow down a little bit." He said, "Just remember this, that science and art are simply the incremental discovery of what God has already created." One sentence, that says it all. One sentence.
Wow. That's a pretty good thing to get from a father.
One other, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You said
an addendum to that, though, because I was asking, some questions about religion and whatnot. He said again, slow down. He said, there are only 2 things you have to remember about God. Number 1, he has a sense of humor. And number 2, he's a gentleman, and as such, he always keeps his word. He said, that's all you have to learn.
Good stuff. So, what about the title, Another Kind of Eden? Is this a reference to Steinbeck's East of Eden, and how does that play into it?
Yeah, you got me. I, for years, have been trying to figure out a way to get that word on the cover of one of my books, because that title, East of Eden, is one of the best I think that was ever used in American publishing. And of course, the story East of Eden by Steinbeck is one of the best uses of the literary story in the Old Testament. It's just enormous success as a book and, of course, as a film. And so this is my attempt maybe to give some tribute to John Steinbeck. You remember what he said about Montana? He said, Montana is not a state, it's a love affair.
Steinbeck also said this. I pulled this up today, and talking about East of Eden, he said, it has everything in it I've been able to learn about my craft or profession in all these years. I think everything else I have written has been, in a sense, practice for this. Do you feel that way about this book and about Aaron Broussard?
Well, I try to. And when I say that, I mean I try to have the same kind of humility that was always characteristic of Steinbeck. This man had this enormous talent, but he never seemed to make much of it. I remember he once said, after he received the Nobel Prize, he said that I have accomplished, how do you put it, a small amount of very good work out of a lifetime of drudgery behind my typewriter keys. In other words, he looked at just a small part of his work as ultimately sublime. I think it was all that way. I mean, from the beginning, Steinbeck always did more than he had to. He volunteered for World War II when he was way beyond the draft age, and went on night commando raids with British and American troops and got into some really bad scrapes with the Nazis. Never made anything of it. He's a very humble man, evidently.
Well, if you want to stay humble, like you say, don't read the back of your book. You got you got Dennis Lehane here saying
you're on there.
Level of talent. I don't want to jump the shark here, but I feel that when we're traveling with Aaron in these two books that he talks to us directly in first person, that we're with the guy who's going to be a Steinbeck, who's going to write the great American novel. Is that what we're seeing here?
Well, yes. His history as a writer is similar to my own. In this book, he has written a novel and that has a title probably suggested by a poem written by Edwin Arlington Robinson, but it's been rejected everywhere. And he has left his job, got fired from his teaching job in Lafayette, where he was teaching at the University of Southwest Louisiana. And he's become a drifter, riding what's called the hot shots. Those are trains, freight trains that go to a certain destination. They don't stop till they get to one destination. And that's what his life is, in effect. He does not believe that he's ever going to accomplish anything until he becomes a published writer. But he's doing all of these other things that are getting himself into a lot of trouble. And he has great empathy, and you're aware of this, all people in the arts are, that without an understanding of our fellow man, we will never have a story to tell. The great stories are all around us, but we have to learn the territory. The territory is in the human heart. And this is his great gift. He understands simple people, working class people, and the underclass. And he has an enormous sympathy for the dignity in their lives. And he has many things to say about the religiosity that seems born in them. I lived in a village. My Pearl and I and our first child lived in a village in Mexico back in '61, very primitive place. And people wore guns. It was dangerous. There were soldiers with M1 rifles would sit on top of the bus to protect people from the bandits. I saw a mass burial, mass killing. But anyway, the point is, you look in the faces of those people, and it's something holy in them. It's like they were baptized right in front of your, a hand reached out and touched their foreheads. You could swear they were built, they came from the clay, just right out of God's hands. And I've always felt that way about them. I worked a bit with migrant workers out in California, but I didn't mean to get off the subject. My point is, the great story, and you know this, it's always right around us, but you have to be a good listener, and you gotta just be silent and watch the great story. It's there. It's always happening.
In The Jealous Kind, as we said before, set in the 50s, and you said most of the popular film and so forth that comes out of the 50s is not realistic, and you were trying to peel that away and show the 50s.
Yeah.
And so is that what you're trying to do with this new book and with the 60s? It seems like you've picked a time that's on the cusp of major social change in this country, this world, I guess, and you're kind of like trying to get to the root of that, the real root, not that we look back at now through gauze and see that as a wonderful moment before possible the downfall of Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, you said it again. Yes, the 1960s was one that opened a portal to some, for good or bad, to great change in American society. As you said, that we were on the brink of nuclear war. This story takes place right before the Cuban Missile Crisis. We came right to the edge, 2 hours from nuclear annihilation. And this is not my perception. These are the words of John Kennedy, 1962, 3 weeks after he told the Navy and the Marines to stand down, 2 hours before they went over the gunwales into the LSTs. Anyway, this is what he said to America. Victory would have been ashes in our mouths. And then he went on to say that in the first month, 185 million, guaranteed, 1 in 185 million Americans would have died. That was just the beginning. He said, but he rolled the dice anyway. Well, we haven't left that time. The same players are out there, just different names. Mr. Putin's alive and well and active in Eastern Europe. He's probably one of the most dangerous people on the planet. Anyway, but also it was the beginning of the drug culture, acid. A lot of great things happened in the 60s, but it was also a violent period. We think of Kent State, for example. But there was a book written toward the end of the 60s. It had the most iconic kind of title. It's exact in its meaning of its designation of what the 60s was about. The title was "Don't Shoot Where Your Children." That's it.
Yeah.
There was a lot of dark things going on. Do you know what Charles Manson said? He was asked once by a reporter, as I remember, and the reporter said, how did you get all these young girls under your power? Because they came from middle-class families, they're just kids. They were just, innocent, and their lives were ruined, and they committed heinous deeds. And Manson's answer was, I walked up to them when I would see them sitting on a curb, and all I had to say was, when did your father throw you out? And he was a psychopath, and he was a psychopath who ruined their lives. But the whole country was full of kids like that. We lived in a commune a while, back in the 60s. We were a little older.
That sounds like another book. So
We were middle-aged already.
with another kind of Eden, let's talk about your choice to engage in the supernatural here. This is not something that's new with you. I remember going all the way back to In the Electric Mist with the Confederate Dead.
Yeah.
I remember thinking as I read it, this was a daring thing to do, to put the idea of ghosts in a mystery novel.
Yeah.
And I loved it. It might still stand as my favorite one of your books, but in this case, how does it come about? Is it demanded by the DNA of the story? What makes you decide to take that step?
Well, as you mentioned, the supernatural is in most of my work, and going way back to a degree, but not to the degree that we find the supernatural in this new book, Another Kind of Eden. I call this my Steve King book, and I say this with great reverence because I think Steve King is a great writer, and he's also a very fine human being. He's the fellow. There's nobody who has worked harder than that man. I mean, this man has been a writer all of his life. He reminds me of Ernest Hemingway in a way. Hemingway was once, talk about obsession. Somebody asked Hemingway about his obsession with writing, and of course, that Hemingway had problems that Steve doesn't, but Hemingway get into fights with people, and he drank too much, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, someone said, "Did you ever see psychiatrist Mr. Hemingway?" And Hemingway replied, "Oh yes, every day, Dr. Smith Corona." Every day. That's Steve. He's a good fellow.
I don't want to cross the line with you, but what is your own connection to ghosts, or what do you feel about ghosts and literary ghosts? I had to write this stuff down. We've mentioned Diogenes, Steinbeck, Frost. I think Irving Shulman was the guy who wrote the.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, so. Yeah. When I talk to you, I just feel this amazingly strong connection to the writers of the past, and even going back centuries. Are these like? Do you feel like you write with the ghosts of writers around you? What is your connection to that?
Well, it's interesting you put it that way, Michael, because my first creative writing teacher was at the University of Missouri. It was Dr. John Nyhart, who wrote Black Elk Speaks, the story of this Indian shaman who saw the future, and sadly it was a tragic vision that he had. But also, again, my father had a remarkable view of history, and he believed that time was not sequential. He believed that all events occur simultaneously, the past, the present, and the future. And he said, as though in a dream in the mind of God. And he said, if we'll accept that, many of our mysteries are no longer mysteries. And he says, this is why we owe a debt to the earth. We owe a debt to the unborn, and they're waiting for us to send some message that they'll be safe when it's their time to enjoy history. But he also believed this is the reason that many people discover a phenomenon, perhaps an experience that they can't explain with the dead, or just with specters in the swamp. The way Dave Robichaud sees them in the Spanish Lake it's called Spanish Lake outside of New Iberia. I've had one arguably experience that I cannot explain, that I am absolutely convinced happened. And it was through my daughter, Pamela. And Pamela was a psychic. Pamela had a gift. The family, everybody in the family knew it since she was a little girl. And it was, this was about 10 or 12 years ago. And she called me up and she was hysterical. And I told her, I said, just come on, quiet down. And she said, no, Daddy, I've had vision, and it was in my sleep, but she was not asleep. She said there were 3 men standing in my room, and then she gave me their names. First, she said, a man called Danny, and I don't want, it's a long story. Anyway, she gave me the names. These are names she could not have known. It was my uncle and my 2 cousins. They were all from the Holland family. And they were the 3 closest men that relatives I had among my mother's family. But Pamela had never met them. She didn't know about them. And one of them was my cousin Weldon, who is the protagonist in Wayfaring Stranger. And I loved Weldon. He was like my older brother. And he went all the way across. He fought from D-Day all the way across France until the Elbe River. He was at the liberation of the Dachau. He had the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. And he left a lung in Germany and came home with a German girl. But anyway, the 3 men said, and they used my boyhood name. Pamela could not have known these things. He said, tell Jimmy to watch out for the truck that looks like it's hauling pipe, but it's not pipe, it's logs. And your father is in great danger. By this time, I couldn't stand up. My legs were trembling. And I said, Pamela, you've had a vision of people in the other world, but I'm convinced this is real. And then I tried to make a joke out of it. I'll stay away from trucks that look like they're hauling pipe. 2 years passed. Pearl and I were coming over the Canadian border. It was getting toward dusk. I wasn't paying much attention to the highway. Then I saw this truck in front of me. It had boomer chains on it and was carrying what looked like pipes that were bouncing under the chain. They were lodge poles, and one of them slipped, and here it came. And I swerved. I almost went off a cliff on the right-hand side of the road. The log missed the left-hand side of my car for about 18 inches. If I had not had some kind of premonition when I made the association with that prophecy that Pamela, that warning she gave me, we probably would at best been badly hurt, but probably killed. So I've had 1 or 2 other events that I cannot explain, but this one is the one that made, if I ever had any doubts of faith, I gave them up at that point. But I've always been a believer, but I can't always say what I believe in. Do you know that? You get yourself in this. Anyway, you join the club and then you don't worry about it anymore.
That's a good way to put it. Well, I think we're going to go to some questions in a second from our audience, but I just a couple of questions that I probably just for me, but I hate the word wordsmith, but I can't think of another word. Maybe Dr. Smith Corona or something. But I think you're the best wordsmith I know writing today, yeah. And it's all genres, no genre. It's just people out there writing, and it's just beautiful work. But what astounds me is that it keeps coming year after year. I read your books and I think this would take most other writers. There'd be 3-4 year intervals between books that are so beautifully written and put together. And so I guess there's probably no answer to this, but I'm saying, like, how do you do it? Like, do you ever spend a day without writing, or is this the all-consuming work of your life?
Oh, it's the work of my life. Like I say, I've been trying to do it since I was a little boy. And I never wanted to be anything other than a writer. And I really appreciate your compliments. And they also, what you said about my work applies to yours as well. And I wanted to give you a quote from one of your books. I forget which one it was. But anyway, on the subject of spirituality and religion, the narrator turns to the reader and says, I usually don't speak in an editorial fashion, but it's been my experience that those who speak about religion the most are those who have the least grasp of it.
Maybe so.
That we should
All right,
get
so
that one
I just want to
Excited.
finish. We're complimenting each other, but I think
Okay.
we're complimenting each other, and that's very much appreciated on my end. But
Okay.
I want to read from your acknowledgments in this new book. And remember, this is the book. If you haven't gotten it yet, get it from Books and Books, and you can order it right here. But anyway, at the end of your acknowledgments, you say, I'll read here. I would also like to thank the readers of my work. They are more than just readers. They have become friends of the most loyal kind, sharing in our mutual desire to protect and save the earth and all its inhabitants. And I think that's just a wonderful sentiment to put in the last page of this book. And now if Christine can come back and tell us if you have any questions from the audience.
We do. Okay, so here's one. I'm guessing Michael would agree that James Lee has created one of the great protagonists in contemporary fiction in Dave Robichaud, and that James Lee would agree that Michael has done the same with H. Bosch. No doubt the latest pages on James Lee's Aaron Holland Broussard would be in a similar vein. The question for both of you is, when you are creating the stories about these characters, what is your mindset as you're writing, and how do you occupy that state of mind during your work?
That's a very good question. I've never planned the stories, and I call it the kind of cure for insomnia, I guess. I started about 4 o'clock in the morning. I keep a pad of paper next to my bed, and things come to me then, and I see maybe 2 scenes into the story, but I never know where the story is going. I don't know where they come from, and I've probably said this and confused people before, that I don't remember writing the story later, and I do not write it later. I don't remember it, and it's always been that way. But it reminds me of 2 things that Hemingway and Faulkner said, and I'm not comparing my work with theirs, but Faulkner said, had I not written the books, another hand would have written them for me. And Ernest Hemingway, right before his death, he took his life over in Sun Valley. He called his wife, his first wife, Hadley. She was the love of his life. And he said he reread the manuscript of The Snows, The Old Man in the Sea. And he said it was like someone else had written it. But I know what they were talking about. That's it. It feels that for me, and I think for most artists, that it has to do with the recognition that it's a gift that comes from some hand outside of oneself. And the most dangerous moment in an artist's career is to convince himself that it is he who has created this great gift. In other words, to step into a self-created vanity that eventually will be pernicious. It will destroy his art. It's not in the ego. It's an impression, in my mind at least, that some voice, some within. Look, if you ever go to psychiatrists, this is the first question they ask. Do you hear voices? quickly say, no, of course not. Otherwise, they'll put you in a straitjacket. But of course, an artist hears. I've heard them all my life. I've got Ebbets Field running around in my head. But you got to just kind of smile a little bit. Don't talk too much about what goes on your head. It's like you're going to end up with scorch marks from electroshock therapy.
It's a good answer. It's a good answer. I can't really add to it, but the part that you say about not remembering writing stories, I get that so well, to the point of embarrassment, because I'm involved like in TV shows where they're adapting my books and questions come up and I have no memory of. I think they think I'm an imposter. They think I didn't really write these books because I can't answer questions about them because I write them and forget them. So the way you are like an instrument that something, you do feel like an instrument that something is passing through.
It's a bad moment in Hollywood when one of these fellows who's paid a big chunk of money ask you a question. You said, heck if I know.
You have to read the book.
You have such a great laugh. Oh my God, such a wonderful laugh. Okay, so someone would like to know, for James Lee, do you have a spiritual perspective about the pandemic?
Well, you mean, if I do, it would be the following. I think we're abusing the earth and it's paying us back. It originates with animals, and the animals are sick. They have given us the contagion again and again, almost every pandemic. I mean, through the ages, going back to the 14th century. It's drought that produces the virus. And I think we have, I believe we've done a great amount of harm, not simply to the planet, to the physical planet, but to its other denizens, and that's namely the animal world.
Okay.
Hello?
Sorry, I'm back. I thought you had more to say on that. Do you have a favorite book of your own?
Well, it's the 3 Holland books, but in truth, I respect them all because every one that I wrote was the best book I could write at the time. And some are stronger than others. But I've never regretted at least the amount of effort that I put in my work. My early work was often dark as though seen through a glass darkly. And I actually rewrote, or re-edited, Lay Down My Sword and Shield, my 3rd published novel, because I felt I owed the protagonist, who was also one of the Holland family. Other than that, I've never written anything I felt I couldn't defend, put it that way, but it was the best I could do.
Great. I'm going to open the chat just in case anyone wants to say something there. We don't have any other questions right now, but
I did see one on the chat, so I'll throw it out there. Mm-hmm. Jim, the Holland, I know that Robichaud's gone through the Hollywood machine and so forth, but what about the Holland books? Is there any effort, or will we ever see something like that made into television or film?
I surely hope so, but I've had some people who had an option on 1 or 2 times, maybe 3, I don't know, but they didn't go anywhere. My own feeling, this is my own feeling about my work, that as as a film adaptation, or perhaps better, a television adaptation, the greatest potential for real artistic merit is there with the Holland story. Why? Because it's the story of America. The Robichaud stories, yes, they have part of the American story, but they're linked more to psychological themes, Caribbean themes, neo-colonial emphasis. But the Holland story is the story of humankind. It was John Neihart who told me this. He said, Jim, never forget that civilization follows the sun. And he said, that means America has followed the sun. And he said, that's where your art should go. I was 20 years old when he told me that. He knew Buffalo Bill Cody. Can you imagine that? Golly Moses, he was my poetry teacher. That means I'm really old.
Okay, here's another question. Who do James Lee and Michael like to read? Who do you like to read, both of you?
Well, Michael, let you take that.
Well, as I said, I pretty much learned from James Lee Burke, but I like to jump around. Another book that just came out that I would highly recommend is called Razor Blade Tears by S.A. Cosby. And he's a new writer. He's had a couple of novels, a lot of short stories, and he's really doing some great work talking about, Jim's books being the story, the Holland books being the story of America. Cosby is also, I think, doing that in his own right, and he's a really good writer to jump on with now. I think that would be my recommendation besides this one.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm going to, this is familial. Alafair Burke is one of my first people I would recommend. And Alafair, was precocious. She could read Cool Hand Luke when she was 5 years old. She picked it up and started reading it in our living room out loud. And she's been writing short stories since the first grade. But she's written some really great books. I think she's contributed an enormous amount to what are called legal thrillers, but they're far more than that. Anyway, we have many great writers in our midst. Ron Hansen is one of the people I've most admired in my career, and Ron's still working. He's a screenwriter now. And my first cousin, Andre Dubus, we grew up together. We grew up literally together in Lake Charles and Lafayette, and we were 4 months apart. And Andre, I think, is America's greatest short story writer. His son is a very good writer, Andre III. But there are too many to mention. And Michael's always very humble. Michael and I we share a commonality in our experience. We were both police reporters. And that's where you really learn to get it right. You get it right. Michael always gets it right.
Try to.
So someone is saying your view of time in your books is very Faulkner-like. The past is never over. It is not even past. Is this purposeful on your part to acknowledge Faulkner?
Well, I think it's an impossibility to speak of literature without eventually raising the name and work of William Faulkner. Faulkner could sit down with William Shakespeare, Geoffrey Chaucer, John Keats, and Milton. He was a titan, man who's been poorly educated, actually. I mean, he came from an educated background, but Faulkner's talent's incredible. And I think of course, others, that who are involved with the past. Flannery O'Connor's not spoken of much anymore. But she had that talent for reaching back into this history, and the Southern history is Gothic. It's not simply Gothic, but sometimes the stories are very dark indeed, and she turned them into a melody. It's just remarkable what she was able to do. Eudora Welty, also, the Southern literature from 1920, from 1940, was one of the great renaissances in the entirety of world literature. The number of people who came out of the South. Robert Penn Warren is neglected. Thomas Wolfe, North Carolina. It can go on and on. Erskine Colwell.
Someone is saying what makes your books so extraordinary is the attention to detail, the detailed sustained metaphor, call it poetry on its side, and also the ongoing complex interior dialogue of the protagonist. There you go. So I have a question for both of you. Just as a bookseller, are there any bookstores that have meant something to you in your life? Like any bookstore stories that you could share with us about their importance in your lives?
Oh, their importance is just, I can't repay what they've done. And I learned, maybe because I had a hard time publishing, I always wrote more easily than I published. And it took me 5 years to get my first novel into print, The Half of Paradise. I finished it when I was 23 years old, and I wrote most of it, much of it by hand when I worked on a pipeline in Texas. And I discovered early on in publishing the number of people who make the difference whether a book is successful or not. And many of them do so many things and with so little reward, and oftentimes with no recognition whatsoever. And that includes the sellers of books all over the country. Librarians are another group, the humble librarian sitting back there in the corner, buried in all these files and books. But and here's the real big one, though. This happened, and I don't remember the lady's name. This happened. I'd been out of print 13 years in the middle of my career. I wrote during all that time, but it was a really tough time. I couldn't get in. Nobody would touch my work with a tongue fork. Anyway, literally, it made people mad for some reason. Anyway, this lady in the San Fernando Valley, she had a bookstore. She always had these cats in there, and she was a friend of lots of editors. I saw the letter she wrote to Macmillan's, one of the big publishers, and she said, there's a young fellow named James Lee Burke, a friend of James Connolly, who's written she said, he's written this masterpiece of a book, and Hollywood, this is a quote, Hollywood is scratching at his door to get him to sign a contract. Listen, I couldn't give away hell. I couldn't give ice water away in hell. What happened? One guy called the other guy in New York. 6 houses bid on Black Cherry Blues. 6 of them did, and it sold for $205,000. I was teaching at a time when we couldn't actually pay the mortgage. Every month we were late on the mortgage. We had 3 kids in college at the same time. We were poor and we were working all the time, still dead broke. Suddenly, so $205,000 comes through the door because of a some lady writes a letter from the San Fernando Valley Anyway, I never told anybody that story. I was afraid they'd find out and take the money back.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you. So shall we take one more? Both of you have aged your characters, Robichaud and Bosch. It is great to see this and not just a character disappearing. Have you intentionally done this?
Well, have I? Yes, I did. In the Robichaud stories, I thought I had concluded the series at about 19, and then I forget what it was. It was something that got on my mind. About rock and roll. That was it. And Larry Finnegan and the song "Dear One." You know that song? Golly, it came out in 1962, but it's really a 1950s song. And I thought, I got to have a run again at rock and roll in the 50s. And I went back into time, in this case with the story Private Cathedral. And it begins in Galveston, Texas on an amusement pier. And in the 50s and 60s, those were all over the Gulf Coast. So it was just great. Rock and roll band and a shooting gallery and a roller coaster and the Ferris wheels. Good God, was America a great country. It was a wonderful time to be around. And it was about music. And so I just took Cleet and Dave back quite a few years, couple of decades, and said, here, you're going to hear what it was like back then. It begins when Dave Robichaud says, back when we had presidents like Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman, before the clown car arrived. And then we're off and running.
So I'm going to read one comment from a man named Gary. Many years ago, I was very ill with cancer. A friend introduced me to Mr. Burke's books. As Dave Robichaud overcame his demons, his strength increased mine. I survived. After my recovery, I wrote to Mr. Burke. After reading my letter, he called me to say hello and check on my health. Mr. Burke is a wonderful writer and a fine man who helped to save my life. So there you go.
That's very kind.
So I think I would love to end on that note, thanking you both for your work, for being with us here in our virtual bookshop, for your time, for your energy, for everything, those wonderful stories that you have put out into the world that we value so greatly. And just to thank our viewers for joining from everywhere. Remind you that you can buy the book. If you haven't gotten it already, you can buy it here in the green button here on the screen, or if you're in Miami, you want to come by one of our stores, but it would be wonderful. We'll ship it right out to you. And I just want to thank you for supporting independent bookstores. It's been a really delightful conversation, and thank you.
Well, thank you too, Miss Christiana, and also Michael, as always. Sure. Michael is always the friend and he's a great man. Michael that's the standard.
Glad to have been here.
All right.
Hear some of these new stories.
Yeah.
All right. We'll say good night. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Be well.
Thank you.